Okay, I think I will make a start. Welcome everyone to the culmination of our Careers in Humanitarianism Day. My name is Dr. Jessica Hawkins. I'm a lecturer in Humanitarian Studies at HUI here in Manchester. And I would just firstly like to point out that this session is being recorded, just to let you know. And then I would also like to say a huge thank you to Jess Murphy and my colleague Sophie Roberg for organising today's day. It's been an absolutely amazing event, and hopefully it's been useful for a lot of our students and participants for understanding the different options available for careers in humanitarianism. So I just want to take a few minutes to introduce the topic today. A couple of years ago, my colleague Wabina Jasani and I were sat discussing in her office about the topic of mental health and humanitarianism, and two issues were raised. Basically, we were training our postgraduate students at the time. This was before we had undergraduates. We were training our postgraduates to understand the theories, the critiques, the approaches to humanitarianism and international disaster management so that they could go forward with a career in humanitarianism. But we weren't necessarily providing them with the kind of training that they would need in order to cope with the consequences of working within a career in humanitarianism. And then we were also conscious about the fact that we teach a lot of distressing topics every single day. And as a result, we started talking. We eventually launched a module on mental health and psychosocial support, which involved a lot of interactions from practitioners and those with experience. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we've not been able to run that module, but what we have instead is a fantastic panel of speakers here today who are going to speak about their experiences of working within the humanitarian sector and supporting those working within the humanitarian sector, and how mental health affects those who are affected by humanitarian crisis, but also those who are helping those affected by humanitarian crisis. So I just want to introduce the three speakers today. We have Liza Reilly, who's Director of GISF, and she will be speaking today on the perspective of security and how poor mental health could put individuals at risk. Then we have Dr. Liza Jachens, who's from Webster University, and she'll be speaking about occupational risks and how humanitarian organisations themselves can affect the mental health of their workers. And finally, we have Dr. Gemma, Houldey, who is from Sussex University, who will be speaking about what humanitarian organisations can do to help the mental health of their workers. And we are going to... There's obviously the chat, so you can post any questions you have there in the Q&A question section, or just the general chats there for general points or comments. But we will take formal questions at the end of the session of the three speakers speaking. And if you have a specific question for a speaker, could you please put that in the Q&A as well. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Liza Reilly. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jessica, and thank you for inviting me to speak today on a topic which is very close to my heart, and I'm really looking forward to listening to the other speakers on the panel later. So, as was mentioned, I work for an organisation called GISF. It's the Global Interagency Security Forum, which is a peer support network for the global security leads for mainly humanitarian NGOs, but also human rights based organisations and development NGOs who work in sort of multiple countries overseas. People are often surprised at why a security interested body would be interested in sort of mental health and well-being of staff, but stress management has been incorporated into sort of personal security training for many years, and this has grown out of the fact that we recognise that people make bad decisions when they're stressed, And this can really have a consequence not only on the safety and security of you as an individual, but your colleagues and your team around you. And over the last few years, as we've looked into this more, the whole idea of organisational resilience, which is something that, again, we look at in security, is really impacted by the resilience of the individuals. And is the team resilient? Does the organisation have the capacity to continue to function after serious incident or crises? And unfortunately, within the humanitarian sector, we do see a lot of those incidents that we need to be able to continue to work afterwards. So for us, it is a very important topic if we're really going to make sure that organisations are keeping our staff safe and secure. I stopped working in the field full time about 10 years ago, and while there have been many improvements and things are changing, with the people I talk to, I think a lot of the issues that I saw when I was working overseas still exist, and still can make it difficult for us to look after ourselves when we are working in the field. So I want to talk a bit about some of those for us to be aware of. So the first one is sort of the context that we work in. If you think about most of the humanitarian response programs we do, it will either be in a conflict zone, after a major natural disaster. So just because of that, the context itself is going to be challenging. There are often curfews, underlying issues which sort of raise the stress level on a regular basis. If you're in a conflict zone or there's a lot of crime, there isn't really a justice system. This is all going to have an impact on yourself and how you're coping with the situation. And one of the consequences of this is a lot of what would normally be our coping strategies at home, gym, restaurants, social occasions, there's very limited, so it changes what our coping strategies might be. And the other issue on that can have a big impact is the fact that we often live and work with the same people. So it's not like you leave the office and you go with a completely different set of people, but these things are following with you and you're staying within this same group of people all of the time, and you don't really a lot of the time get sort of time off to recover from the stresses that you're coping with on a day-to-day basis. If we add to that, I think quite surprisingly, considering the number of women who are now working in the humanitarian sector, it is generally considered still to have a very macho culture. Asking for help, being seen to be struggling, these are all seen as weaknesses. You know, it's very important that, you know, you're strong, that you're there, you're able to keep working to help the people, which is the reason you're there in the first place, to really maintain the programs that you're trying to do. And this was certainly, again, from personal experience. I was working in Afghanistan. The organisation I worked for had an R&R policy. It was 6 weeks in, then sort of a long weekend or a week off. But the policy wasn't enforced, and to a certain extent wasn't even encouraged, because we were so busy. And individuals were expected to go, I'm okay, or I need it, need to leave now. But when one person didn't go, it meant that others felt that it would be a sign of weakness if they went. So we tended not to, and the gap spread. I still remember vividly, there was one particular house meeting in the evening, at a very minor point, burst into tears, fled from the meeting. I mean, really, that's not how I normally behave. And my boss came to see me afterwards and we worked it out. It had been 12 weeks since I'd actually gone on a break, and I just kept going and going and going. And none of us had really noticed the deterioration in the state I was in. So I had a very good week in Islamabad to recover. And this is something that again shocked me as to how little this has changed. We did a small research piece a couple of years ago on how people coming newly into the humanitarian sector saw safety and security. And despite the messages that organisations were generally giving around, you know, people looking after themselves, making sure they were secure, the underlying culture in the sector continued to be that you weren't a proper humanitarian until you'd been shot at. And this came from a variety of people working for different organisations. So we are still dealing with this sort of very macho, very sort of strong culture that we work in, and it isn't changing. And then the third point is around this belief that why can I be feeling like this? Why am I anxious? Why am I depressed? I'm so lucky. When I finished my time overseas, the organisation I worked for was quite progressive at the time, and they strongly encouraged me to do a debrief with a psychotherapist, which I'm very grateful for. And I ended up in therapy for quite a while after that. And this was one of the key points that we talked about, was around this belief that I had no right to be so stressed, because I could leave the environment, which I did. You know, my family, my community had not been decimated by conflict or natural disaster. So I was so lucky. And apparently this is very common amongst aid workers, as well as other professions such as journalists, where people are working in these environments. And there's lots of work being done now around vicarious trauma and the impact of vicarious trauma. But, you know, really recognizing that your feelings are valid and you're entitled to feel as you feel is so important. And it's been interesting with COVID-19. I've had similar conversations with a number of people who've said, but I still have my job. I have a garden for my children to play in. It's not right for me to feel like this. So really recognizing, you know, that you are entitled to the feelings that you have, and they're valid. And I think the final comment I want to make is around some of the coping strategies that we turn to when we are in the field. There are better practices, and I have seen real improvements. Everywhere I've been recently, there's normally been a yoga class going on somewhere, which is great. A lot of organisations have installed exercise equipment, so people can actually exercise even with it. There's a curfew and they can't go out. So we are seeing some really positive things, but there continues to be sort of risky behaviour. Alcohol and drugs, which can be often used as a good coping strategy. The line between it being part of the solution and part of the problem is quite thin. And I know when I was in the field, there was a book circulating called Emergency Sex. It may not have been as exciting a book as we had anticipated from the title, but it was really interesting to see some honest stories of what sort of risky behaviours that people were doing to cope with the stresses that they faced. So I think I will finish on that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. As I just said earlier, if you've just joined us a bit late, if you've got any questions for a specific speaker, please put them in the Q&A section of the chat, and we will return to all the questions at the end after the third speaker. And so now I'd like to pass it over to Lisa Jachens, who will be talking about occupational risks and how humanitarian organisations themselves can affect the mental health of their workers. Thank you, Liza.
Thanks very much, Jessica. All right, I've got a slide share for you, which I think I'll start setting up, and hopefully that's working for everybody. Okay, so firstly, welcome everybody, and thank you for the invitation as well.
Lisa, sorry, your screen is sharing the notes pages rather than the slide.
Oh, is it? All right, let me do that again then. Let's
Thank
not
you.
do that. That doesn't look very nice. Okay, so hopefully that's better then. Okay. So today I'm going to be basically covering the etiology, which is the risk factors that are prevalent for this particular sector. And then I'm going to be having a look at the prevalence of mental health outcomes. And then finally, just a very quick look at some of the interventions and what we can learn from the research that we've done so far. So firstly, we do actually live in a very challenging context. All humanitarians live in a very challenging context, and they have many, many stresses. And because of all these stresses, it actually results in a very high incidence of psychological distress. And what I mean by psychological distress, it can mean things like burnout and anxiety, depression, PTSD, all those types of things. And what the challenge is right now is actually that we don't know with any certainty the complexity of the pathways from these stresses to the high incidence of psychological distress. So there are many things that affect that pathway. So it can be things like, personal and resilience factors, can be work demographics, it can be occupational and organizational stresses, and they all interact to affect that pathway from the stresses to the high incidence of psychological distress. And when we understand these pathways a lot better, we can start designing better health interventions and better work policies and practices. So I promised to talk about the risks in this sector. So I'd like to think about them as three main risks. And the first risk area is situational. And so in this, they're also known as occupational risk factors. And these can be things like traumatic events, frightening situations, witnessing people in distress, as Liza mentioned, that sort of vicarious trauma, difficult living conditions. And these are all sort of things that are inherent in the job. The second main area are job-related factors, and these are called organizational stresses. And these are about the design, management, and organization of work. And they would include things like work demands, bullying, job insecurity, long working hours, and also the extent to which employees perceive fairness in the processes of making decisions that impact them. And you'll notice that this particular section of risks are not really that specific to humanitarian work. And then the last area are the personal related risk factors, and these can be personality traits, something like perfectionism, for instance, but it can also be your previous experiences, which could possibly make you more at risk for mental health outcomes. So let's have a look at what humanitarians themselves say about their risks and their work-related stress. So I interviewed 58 humanitarian workers in Geneva, and they spoke about their experiences of stress. And I'll just briefly touch on some of the themes. If you want a full look at all of the themes, you can have a look at a paper that I wrote. So the first theme was this emergency culture. And this is when employees felt compelled to meet and fulfill the need of others. And I think this quote really demonstrates this really beautifully. Many external expectations put pressure on the organization. This creates constant pressure internally to satisfy expectations, sometimes undefined expectations. That causes us stress. The challenging aspect is to balance strict internal deadlines and at the same time respond to the multiple demands of external countries. I feel we are always in emergency mode. Okay, now this emergency mindset was deeply embedded and an accepted cultural norm in the organization. But from and I think that's easy to understand why, okay? But from a health perspective, This constant feeling of crisis in an organization really leaves very little room for recuperation, planning, prioritizing, and even self-care. So I believe we do need this shift from a reactive approach to a more proactive approach, where there can be better planning, better supervision, perhaps better management of work. I'm sure this is a lot easier said than done, though. This is it's something quite big to address. And the second theme that I'm going to highlight today is work overload. Okay, many humanitarians expressed that they were constantly overloaded, high level of work demands, and they also mentioned that their context was continually changing. Again, some quotes here: "I'm exhausted each day and feel life is a marathon, and people are stretched so far, there's nothing to lean on." Okay, so I think that's quite clear that the workload is really high. Now for some good news. The rewards of humanitarian work are substantial. Okay, they perceive the rewards as very motivating, very meaningful. And the good news was that this provided some form of protection against mental ill health. And there's some lovely quotes there as well. I identify with the powerful and motivating mission of protecting and helping. I feel a human connection with each person we have helped. And another one was talking about the tingle of knowing what you're doing matters. Okay, so that's all wonderful news. However, now there is a little bit of a downside to this. The risk to health is that some humanitarians become overcommitted and over-engaged, and it is this excessive devotion to work which makes it really difficult for them to separate or have healthy boundaries between home and work. They find it really difficult to switch off from work, so they're always on culture. And again, we've got some nice quotes to highlight this. "We are over-engaged, perhaps because of the mission. I know that my passion feeds into the organizational demands and expectations." I think that's really super interesting. So I think the relationship between engagement and health is probably curvilinear. So what I mean by that is, as engagement goes up, so does health. So, you know, that's a good thing. So people more engaged and then they're more healthy. But there seems to be this tipping point where when people become too engaged or over engaged, there may be some deterioration in their health. When they talked about buffers for stress, they talked a lot about having supportive managers and colleagues, but they also talked about managing these boundaries between work and life. Okay. All right, I think we've got quite a few insights now. Not many, we're in a short time span today, into the risks about workplace, the risks and the stress. So I just thought maybe we could just have just a little quick glimpse at some of the results that I've been looking at. This is just for depression and anxiety. And if you look first at the general population statistics, you can see that for the general population, the risk for anxiety and depression is well under 10%. And then if you compare that to 3 humanitarian studies, one of which is mine, you can see that the risk doubles, sometimes triples for anxiety and depression. You'll also notice actually that there's quite a bit of difference in the health outcomes across those 3 studies. And that's because the risks will change according to the context, according to the hardship station, according to whether your sample is national or international workers. And so the point is that we do have to be quite careful when we're collecting data on what our sample size looks like and the characteristics of our sample. I certainly found some differences between the international workers and the national workers. So the patterns changed across the outcomes, and I found that the international workers were significantly more at risk for the heavy drinking, and national workers tended to be a little bit more at risk for PTSD and secondary stress. If we delve a little bit closer into the heavy drinking study, we also identified other risk factors for heavy drinking. What was really surprising is that we found that women were more at risk for heavy drinking, and this was actually contrary to sort of general population norms. And what is even more interesting actually is that I've also done some UK police studies, and we found the same thing. We found that the women had slightly higher risks for heavy drinking. And this does seem to be sort of specific to human services. So I don't know the answer as to why, and maybe we need to do a qualitative study on that if anybody wants to join in. But we did do we also highlighted some other risk factors. So key is that we found that if your organizational stress was really high, it resulted in a tripling of your risk for heavy alcohol consumption. That's really a lot in odds ratios. And then there were others, such as being really highly overcommitted, your working base being in Switzerland, and then also being under 18, having no children under 18 at home. And then from the previous slide, also being an international worker. So yeah, we can see that actually organizational stress is a very good predictor for alcohol. But what's interesting is that organizational stresses seem to be predicting all the health outcomes really well. So I've looked at burnout, anxiety, depression, and every single time it seems to be the organizational stresses rather than the occupational stresses, which includes the trauma exposure, that seem to be predicting the health outcomes a bit better. Even for something like for a health outcome really closely related to trauma, if I look closely at the data, we can see that if somebody is exposed to trauma, your risks are around 3 times more likely to be at risk for PTSD. But we know that not everybody who experiences trauma goes on to PTSD. So what is this pathway? What are the other things that are making people more at risk? And I found, again, looking closely at the data, that if somebody had been exposed to trauma and they had high organizational stress, that went up to 6 times more likely. And in a way, this is good news because it means that we can actually work on things, work on prevention, and not just focus on the treatment. All right, and I think this is going to end off a little bit on some comments on interventions. I think we need much more focus on primary and secondary interventions, so more focus on prevention and catching problems early. Organizations need to implement a more comprehensive approach to stress reduction. And what I mean by that is that they include both the individual and the organizational level in terms of interventions. So an example of organizational interventions, they may include things like addressing, poor teamwork or management issues, or perceived lack of organizational support. On the individual level, of course, there's things like the counseling or doing briefings before and after a mission. It's also crucial to understand that in different contexts, there may be different stresses and therefore different outcomes. I also think that interventions may work differently in different contexts and through different mechanisms. So that's quite a mouthful, but what I really mean is that I think the interventions need to be tailored to the context, and they need to specifically be culturally relevant and address what's highlighted as what's needed. And that may change across regions, across teams. I think what's going to end off with something which is close to my heart, which is the psychosocial safety climate. It was put forward by Maureen Dollard. And I think this is a really useful starting point for interventions. And this is when managers show support and commitment for stress prevention, and they prioritize psychological health. And it includes things like listening to employee contributions, and employees feel like they're making a meaningful participation in their work life. And when we have this strong strong psychosocial safety climate, employees they feel safer. They feel heard. They feel fairly treated, and they trust and they feel trusted. And I think those are some of the core things that we need to address in the humanitarian sector to improve health. So I think that's pretty much all from me for today. I'll be taking questions a little bit later. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour there.
That's great. Thank you very much, Liza. So we've had two really interesting presentations on kind of what leads to poor mental health outcomes and how organizations can also contribute to that and the roles that they have. And now I'd like to pass over to Dr. Gemma Houldey, who will talk about what humanitarian organizations can do to help the mental health of their workers.
Thank you, and thank you for the other speakers as well. I feel that a lot of what you've just presented there feeds into what I want to discuss here. So just to say, my background's also in the sort of broader sector. I've worked on humanitarian programs and on human rights programs in different countries over the last 15 years, but I've also studied a PhD that researched stress and burnout among aid workers, particularly in Kenya, which included international and national staff. And I'm now just near completion of my book, which is entitled The Vulnerable Humanitarian. So I'm going to be drawing on some of the ideas in that book and indeed what comes out of my research as well. And like I say, just sort of to, I suppose, supplement what's already been said, a lot of the stresses in the sector are related to organisational stresses as much as what is often called the critical incident, the security incident that happens in the field. So really what I'm looking at and what I'm interested in is how we open the space up generally for mental health to become something we can talk about. So creating that psychosocial safety that Liza was just talking about, so that actually mental health and well-being becomes part of the conversation every day in the work that aid workers do and in programs and how they're designed and how they're managed. And really this is about culture change in my eyes. It's how do we change the culture, and that's about what aid workers themselves can do as much as what management can do. So I'm really going to be talking about that as we go on. So I just want to bring this into context a little bit as well, and really to ask this question: what can the last year teach us about mental health and aid work? And we've had this incredible situation with COVID-19 and this pandemic, which impacts directly on aid workers in the sense that many people, certainly expat aid workers, are working from home. They're not able to travel to the field. Those that are working in the field face greater risks in exposure to the virus, as well as sort of the higher pressures of dealing with the needs of vulnerable populations as well that are also exposed to the virus. And just this increasing pressure and different ways of working, which create more stresses than perhaps we'd had previously. In addition to that, I think we cannot ignore some of the discussions around racism and the anti-racist struggle in the last year, particularly on the back of the Black Lives Matter protests. And humanitarian workers and organisations are beginning to ask themselves, well, what does this mean for the people that we work with, our own colleagues in the workplace, and how those dynamics are playing out in the workplace? And I do feel that these things are interlinked in terms of well-being, what well-being actually means when we look at it in our working environments. So really what I would like to propose here is that there are two things we need to consider, and this is what I really talk about in my book, and one is, how can we reframe vulnerability to understand that actually vulnerability doesn't just exist out there with the communities that we work with, that we are all vulnerable, we are all affected by what's going on. And this is really trying to overcome this macho culture that was discussed earlier, to recognize that we all have things that we fear, particularly about fear of harm to ourselves. And if we can understand that about ourselves, we're actually able to connect to other people more as well and understand their vulnerability better. And secondly, how might we have a more inclusive approach to mental health and well-being, so that when we're talking about well-being, we're not adopting this one-size-fits-all approach, which is a mistake that is often made in humanitarian organizations, but instead we are recognizing difference and diversity within the workplace and avoiding reinforcing this white gaze of development, which is often talked about. It was a term coined by an African scholar, by Robtel Nije-Pillay. You know, that there's quite a dominant white narrative when it comes to well-being, when it comes to everything else within the sector. So I'm just going to rush through, because I know we haven't got much time, some of the steps that I suggest for what I believe is self and collective care, how we can welcome discussions and conversations and support around mental health and well-being in the workplace. So in the book, there's actually, as you can see here, there's a sort of quite detailed process that I recommend for organizations and for individuals, recognizing that what's going on outside is also happening inside of us. How can we work with what's happening inside of us so that we can take care of ourselves better, and in doing so, take care of other people better? But I'm just going to sort of really focus on some key themes now without going through the entire process. So first of all, the importance of generating compassion, because of course this is what motivates many aid workers, is this compassion, and yet there's a loss of compassion in the workplace, this macho culture, this idea that we can all be heroes. And that really shuts off a part of ourselves. We're kind of losing love for ourselves when we're acting and performing in this way. So my suggestion, first and foremost, is that we really come back to ourselves. When we're talking about mental health and the stresses of the job, we pay attention to our own body first. So this is something I recommend, is self-care practices to help you settle the body. And I know, as was said, yoga has become very popular now. It certainly wasn't that popular a few years ago when I was working in the field, but I'm glad it is more now. But any kind of practice that's intentionally coming back to your own body and looking after it, and this could be mindfulness practice as well, or it could be dance, really to sort of have that compassion towards yourself and to pause and settle in the body. And secondly, really drawing on what was said earlier about this kind of guilt that people feel, that, you know, we shouldn't be looking after ourselves. But actually, you know, I think the humanitarian sector has a habit of, organizations and staff have a habit of really putting themselves down, feeling they're not doing enough and that they can never do enough, and that, you know, there's a lot out there to suggest that, I know, because of the sort of insurmountable suffering that people are exposed to in this work. But again, pausing to come back to actually remember why you're doing the work and to celebrate that, celebrate those motivations as motivating factors, this sense of meaning. So to take that time, and I know there's lots of different ways that people do that. Certainly what's helped for me is coming back to things that I feel grateful for, including within my work, and things I wish to celebrate within my work, and having that as an intentional practice each day, just to come back to really what's meaningful in what you're doing. moving on to another aspect, which really, once you've kind of generated this compassion more, you can then start to tackle some of the difficult issues which I believe are central to staff well-being within the humanitarian sector. As I said, we have to look at diversity in the workplace, that your experience, and I suppose when I say your experience, I'm thinking particularly of white expat aid workers from the global north, is not necessarily the same experience as everyone else. And if we are going to generate compassion for others and connect with others, that we need to come back to remembering that as well. And that really requires an understanding of how you do relate to power. So there are some suggestions that I have here, just in terms of how you see yourself in the workplace compared with others, and what questions you might want to ask yourself in order to really understand the needs of other people around you as well. So just some suggestions here is to kind of come back to asking yourself, what does power actually mean to you? How have you been aware of it in your own life? For instance, in your work, in your childhood, or in any particular relationships. How is it playing out for you, and how does it affect you? How might you feel powerless? And how might it be that you're holding power in a situation? And I think you don't have to just be a leader or a manager to be holding power, and really just noticing that and seeing how that plays out in the workplace, because this is a way of kind of really challenging this macho culture and seeing how that's playing out. What are the systemic causes of that, and how can we challenge it? And so also, just to introduce here some ideas from Batliwala and Friedman, and they are two feminist development practitioners. They've worked extensively with development organizations particularly, but really to sort of support all sorts of aid organizations, change-making organizations, to look at those power dynamics so that we can really take care of ourselves, take care of each other in a way that's a bit more equitable. So these again are some questions to ask, which you can ask on your own, but you can also ask in teams as well, to start addressing how your personal history with power influences the way that you behave, the way that you behave in the workplace, and how you react to others as well. And that's whether you're a leader or whether you're not a leader, or you're a member of staff. And just, yeah, reflections on how this affects your larger mission and the environment of the organization, and what negative impacts that may have. And again, this is coming back to well-being. How do your actions perhaps affect the well-being of others, but also seeing how someone else's actions affects your own well-being as well. So this is really, it's internal reflection, but it's something I recommend for organizations to do as well, together in teams. And these are difficult questions. These are difficult questions to be asking yourselves, but in order to build more inclusive well-being strategies that are really answering to the needs of everyone, these are sorts of questions that need to be asked. Finally, how might we actually ask those questions? In what settings, what environments welcome such questions? And this is going back to this issue of psychological safety, psychosocial safety. And so what I recommend here is cultivating brave spaces. And this is really spaces where people feel they can be honest about how they're feeling, where people can come in and time is given to listening to and discussing people's doubts, people's fears, anxieties or challenges, but also people's hopes or joys or pleasures, bringing in the emotional experience that gets very lost when we're all trying to be so kind of macho and heroic. And actually really just checking in and bringing those emotions more into the workplace, putting aside this perfectionism, this idea that we should behave like this the whole time. This isn't a human way of being in the world, and we are humanitarians. So as humanitarians, how can you bring that humanity back into the workplace? By being more honest about what's going on for you. So really what I'm talking about here is having more courageous communications. So factoring into the working day conversations around what's going on for you, what I call honest check-ins, where you may actually say, what is it that you're feeling happy about today, or sad about, or excited about, or fearful about, and perhaps having that at the start of every meeting for everybody. So important right now in the midst of the pandemic, and yet people forget this, that you know, there is this struggle happening all the time, and can we check in with each other a bit more? And also just having a more of a feedback culture where we are talking about mental health more readily. And one way to do this is through the Wellness Action Plan, which basically it's developed by the charity Mind with the intention of staff and managers sort of co-creating a support plan where you talk specifically about your own personal stress triggers, how it acts out for you, how it's likely to impact on your work, and you talk about what care you can give for yourself, what your own self-care plan might be, but also what support you can receive from your manager. And it's meant to be anticipatory rather than reactive to a mental health crisis, so that managers know what to do for a particular staff member, and staff recognise within themselves as well what are the triggers, what's the kind of support they're going to need when that happens. Again, this is helping to open up that conversation about mental health and well-being. And lastly, really what I would say is, in this work, and not just looking at sort of well-being generally, but when we're talking about some of these very difficult issues of what happens in the aid sector, about the macho culture, changing that, about power dynamics, we need our own support section, people that we can turn to that can really listen to us and respect us. And it's not about someone that's sort of there to massage your ego or to shame you for the feelings that you have, but who is really there to listen. And that might mean having a sort of listening partnership with somebody, so that you've got someone that you can kind of offload to without judgment. Or it might be having someone that you know can give you really loving feedback that's going to help you change and help you be the best person, the best version of yourself. And that's not the perfect version, let's remember that. It's about bringing yourself back to who you really are and how you can take care of yourself better and be more aware of the needs of your colleagues and people around you as well. So those are just some ideas. Like I say, there'll be a lot more in the book when it's finished, but I'll finish there so we have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and thank you to all three of our speakers. Really interesting topics. I'm just conscious of time, so I'd like to offer you the chance to respond to some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A section and the chats. There is one for each of you and a couple for you all in general. So in terms of the panel in general, do humanitarians become somewhat numb over time to what they are exposed to in the role, and as such to the stress of the job, and how can that be prevented from becoming severely detrimental to personal health? And then from Mark Bradley, who asks, would the panel feel that engaging with a sense of purpose, but with a realistic humility about what we can achieve, would be protective in the well-being of humanitarians? And then for Lisa, in your experience, do humanitarian NGOs offer psychological support? Do they provide consultations? Do they pay for them? And the questions on there. And then for Liza, Jennifer asks, is there a link for heavy drinking in a macho environment? Perhaps is it a culture for drinking encouraged by men, but it's the women who fall into the bad habits? And then finally for Gemma from Stephanie, how can we generate compassion at a leadership level? I'm just going to start with Lisa, is that okay?
As usual, need to remember to unmute. Some really interesting questions. I think to answer the specific one, we do see a growing number of organisations who have contracted companies to provide psychosocial support for staff. often it's a phone call that's available. There's somebody you can reach out to. And if there is a serious incident, that you're offered help. We are unfortunately seeing that as economics become tightened as to how many sessions might be offered that the organisation is paying for. So I think it's getting better, but it varies very much from organisation to organisation. And I think the other thing is that most of these services are targeted to a global north approach to psychosocial care, and it doesn't necessarily offer what that different cultures may want. Though again, I see a growing register within the sector of therapists who are available who speak different languages, so it's not just available in English or French. So seeing improvements, but definitely a long way to go. In terms of some of the other questions, interesting about going numb. I think it can be, but I think it can also become overwhelming. And I suppose different people will have different reactions to it. But I think it may be the opposite of going numb. It just becomes overwhelming in terms of the sheer volume of problems that are out there. And I think that links with that question about this realistic humility of what we can achieve. But I think Gemma and Liza brought up some good points about the organisational culture, that as an individual we may have that humility, but if the pressure from the organisation and our families, the donors, the individuals, I think that can counterbalance the individual realities of what we know we can do. I'll hand over to one of the others.
Yeah, Liza.
Okay, so just a comment on the alcohol question. I think from the reading I did in the macho cultures, it does seem to be, you know, the police and the humanitarian sector anyway, it is the women who seem to be coming out more at risk. But understand that for women to come out more at risk, the cutoffs are different for alcohol consumption between men and women. And so I have a theory, and this is just a theory, is that in the workplaces more and more now equality between men and women, and it could be that the women are keeping up with their peers, but actually they can't drink as much biologically, they can't, and the cutoffs are different. So they'll be classified at risk, and perhaps the man wouldn't be. And so that is just one theory, and I could be completely wrong, because these are surveys, and you know, they're cross-sectional studies, so we don't know necessarily always the reasons behind what we find. So as I say, I think we still need a little bit of more research on that question. In terms of that feeling numb, what sprung to mind for me was perhaps thinking about that and its relationship to burnout, because if the numbness is linked with a withdrawal from work or feeling cynical about work, that could definitely be the sort of signs of burnout, and the solutions for that would obviously be around reducing chronic workplace stress. I'm not sure what other questions. Oh, Mark's question on the sense of purpose. I think, yes, I think that is helpful. I think that is definitely true in my research. In the qualitative, people were saying that it was protective to be motivated and connected to humanitarian mission. And idealistic is not ideal. Okay, so the realistic is the way to go. And I think a lot of young humanitarians set themselves up for failure when they have very idealistic ambitions about what they can achieve. And in the research that some of the stuff that I've come out, it did tend to be the younger humanitarians who had the poorer mental health outcomes. So I think that's one thing to watch out for.
Thank you, Liza. There was just one additional question about the alcohol. Why do you think being based in Switzerland is a risk factor for women? I presume it's because there's just a higher number of humanitarians in Geneva, but
actually Switzerland overall as a country drink quite a lot of alcohol. So that's actually one of the reasons. You know, I do think a lot of alcohol consumption is culture related, and I shouldn't be saying this, but I think in some of the humanitarian organizations you can get alcohol tax-free. So I don't know if some of these things make a difference. And as I say, I don't know the reasons behind some of these things. It's just that we need to know this so that we can tailor our intervention. So we know now if it's a problem in this area, we can go in and target you know, Switzerland or women or and make appropriate interventions. The information's still useful. Yeah.
Thank you. Having lived in Switzerland for a couple of years, I'm going to say no comment. We'll pass over to Gemma.
Thank you. So I'll answer the question that was directed to me specifically first about leadership. It's a great question. I think, you know, leaders, of course, do have a role in setting an example so that you're creating this more compassionate, inclusive workplace. And I think one way they can start is going back to vulnerability again. How can leaders open themselves up for vulnerability so that they too can ask the questions about how they're doing? So for leaders to ask their staff, you know, how am I doing and what leadership do you need from me? And really creating a sort of feedback culture too, where staff feel that they are being supported, where they are given feedback about how they're doing. And that's not just about what's going wrong, it's about what's being appreciated as well. And not just having that in these sort of quarterly review meetings or you know, just assessment of how someone's doing after a few months, but really bringing that in regularly and making it a welcome conversation. Just on the other issues around, numbing in the workplace, numbing, this feeling of numbing, I would say it's so important to come back to the body. And although this is something that people may well need therapeutic support for, I'm not saying that you have to do this on your own and it's all up to you, but actually having that kind of support in embodied exercises that help you relate back to what's happening within you, because that numbing is that detachment from yourself. And so if you can come back to that and to actually be with it, it's much better than pushing it away, than drinking, than all the other sort of habits that are simply pushing it further and further down. And I speak from experience. This has happened to me too, and it's how I have recovered. And just to go through that process of healing is extremely important, but absolutely to ask for help, and that's where your support section comes in, and just that being in a work environment that encourages those conversations to happen as well. Just lastly, on the issue of purpose, absolutely, again, this is kind of what I was suggesting earlier, is can we remember, again, feedback culture, leadership, but generally all staff, all leaders, to come back to what are we appreciating, what is there to celebrate in the work that we're doing. I think that's very often forgotten, and I understand why, because of the pressures of the job, but I think bringing that in is so essential so people really remember why they're there, what's motivating them, and that is going to really generate more well-being, I feel, in the workplace.
Thank you, Gemma. I'm afraid we really have run out of time. There were so many other questions that I have, and we didn't get into the conversation of differences between expat and nationals, which I think is really interesting in the literature as well, and research coming out of that. But if you do have any further questions, please do email us on h2i@manchester.ac.uk, and Jess will pass on your questions to the panelists. Is there any final comment you'd like to add, panelists? No? Okay, great. Thank you.
No.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to thank all the attendees for coming, and especially to Jess and Sophie for organising a fantastic Careers in Humanitarianism Day. So thank you very much.